This video lecture is designed to assist you in better understanding the following issues. What is sound? What are the attributes of sound? What is music? What are the attributes of music? What is the role of listening? How does a composer create? What is musical style or genre? What are the different types of listeners? What do we listen to and respond to in music? How should we describe our music listening experiences? Is music a language and can it truly communicate? How do we determine and assign value to music? And finally, what is good music? How to listen to music? That's a question that oftentimes my students will ask me. Many times they're confused because they see professionals doing one thing that they assume that they're doing, and they see the common lay people doing something totally different. They wonder if their listening experiences are as informed and valuable as those of professionals. They also wonder if the value that they're attaching to the music that they listen to is worthy of that value. The purpose of this particular lecture is to clarify some of these questions. When you finish this lecture, you'll have a very sound grasp on how to listen to music and specifically what to listen for in music and what the results of those listening experiences should be. Now, we have to start off with what is sound. Sound is produced when one object interacts with itself or with another object. Objects interact in such ways that the molecules of those objects will vibrate. Sound vibrates and travels in all directions through what we call waves. Now, there are certain attributes of sound. Those attributes are very common and often associated with music also. But the attributes of sound are pitch, duration, loudness, and timbre. Those attributes define any sound that we come into contact with. Remembering that sound is just waves representing vibrations of an object. Pitch delineates a sound that's either high or low or somewhere in between. Certainly all sound exists or we wouldn't hear it, so it has duration, or how long it is sounding. It also has what we refer to as volume. When you're riding in the car, when you have your earphones on, you'll turn that little knob. It's called a volume knob. What that does is increase the loudness or decreases the loudness and increases the softness. And finally, there's the attribute of what we refer to as timbre. Now, timbre is the most complex and difficult concept or attribute of sound. Timbre is no more than the unique qualities that distinguish one sound from the other. For example, if you consider the voice of a 2-year-old child and you consider the voice of a 30-year-old grown man, there are different qualities to each one of those voices. That quality we refer to as timbre. Another example would be is if I hit the desk versus if I hit a sheet of paper. Now, both of those sounds are produced by striking and hence a vibration, but the timbre is different because of that unique quality that we hear in the sound, and it distinguishes one sound from the other. On the other hand, music is a very special example of sound. So the question remains, what is music? Music is sound, but it is organized sound. Who organizes the sound? More often, initially, the composer organizes the sound. But others can organize that sound just as well. For example, a performer might take what a composer organized and reorganize it in such a way as to express their intents and purposes. And like sound, Since music is organized sound, all music has specific attributes also. Much like the attributes of sound, pitch, duration, loudness, and timbre, music also has those attributes, but it has additional attributes: rhythm, melody, harmony, texture, form, dynamics, articulation, and lyrics. Rhythm is no more than how does it move, the ebb and flow. Melody we can think of as sentences in a paragraph, or maybe even an extended paragraph on its own. It's a message where notes are combined in such a way as to express an idea. They are musical in form to the extent that they can be singable, or in some instances not singable at all. The main purpose here is that the notes are arranged in such a way as to express an idea. Harmony. Harmony is no more than we've got more than one sound going on at the same time. Now, if my voice were the only sound you're hearing, which it is at this current time, it would be very easy to hear and discern what I'm saying. But if I added other voices at the same time, speaking maybe the same words or different words, then those things we are similar to what we refer to as harmony. When we have layers or tiers of sound which are combined, and more often they are harmonious or pleasing, but they don't necessarily have to be harmonious. They can be what we call dissonant or ugly sound. The main point here is that the sounds are layered and combined over the top of each other. Texture. Text is very similar to harmony. Texture simply has to do with how many sounds are we hearing at one time. Are we hearing a soloist sing all by themselves, or are we hearing a soloist with background singers singing to back him or her up? Or are we hearing a soloist sing with background singers with a bass line and a guitar line and a drum line, and all of these lines interconnecting to express one solid idea? Texture. So you can see that texture and harmony are interrelated to the extent that both involve layerings of sounds. Harmony, on the other hand, really is a compositional technique where you make specific choices of which harmonies to use. Also with texture, you make some choices of which textures to use. But harmony is more purposeful in the sense that there are chordal structures which exist which support melodies. And texture is more specific to how many actual things or sounds are engaged at that particular time. Form. Form is no more than how is the song put together. Often musicians will say ABA, AAABA. These are forms. In other words, you have a statement, you have an answer, you have A again, which is a restatement, and then you may have a final statement. And each one of those statements may be similar or different. That is what we refer to as form. And a composer will often think in terms of form when he or she is composing or creating music. We've already discussed pitch, and we've already discussed timbre, and we've already discussed duration. But loudness is a concept that in music we often refer to as dynamics. So if you know what loudness is no more than dynamics. But the key here is to realize that from the point of being very soft, almost inaudible, to being very loud, almost to being distracting, there are gradations in between. And those gradations of how loud or how soft are referred to as dynamics. Articulation. Articulation simply has to do with what emphasis you place on stating the melody or stating the lyrics of the song. Now, I can articulate very clearly. I can emphasize specific things when I speak, or I can articulate very dully, and you can hardly understand what I'm talking about. These are examples of articulation, and all musicians articulate. Composers think in terms of articulation when they're creating melodies and harmonies and how they want to express their ideas. And finally, lyrics. Lyrics are a very special attribute of music because all music will not have lyrics. Lyrics are words. Now, certainly a melody can be lyrical, but technically lyrics are the words to any song. Now, you can understand that if I take one song that has no lyrics and I take another song, the exact same song with lyrics, the clarity and mode of communicating for the latter may be greater, simply because the lyrics are words that directly communicate. We'll have much more to say about that later when we speak in terms of whether music actually communicates. But for now, we want to distinguish sound, that is, when those objects, molecules are vibrating, from music, when a composer or a performer takes sound and organizes the attributes in such a way to express an idea. Next, let's talk about the role of listening, more specifically the role of critical listening. Now, when I was a child, my granny used to make what we call tea cakes. Now, those tea cakes were sort of moderate-sized cookies, you would call them today. In those days, it was easier for Granny to make those cookies than for us to go to the market or to the store and buy some. And by far, the taste, the aesthetic experience of eating those cookies was so rewarding and fulfilling that I've established a long lifetime value set with those tea cakes. Now, unfortunately, my Granny is no longer with us. She's in heaven. And those tea cakes have gone with her because I didn't have the recipe. My mother, my sisters, no one had the recipe. We could guess. We knew there was some of this and some of that, but we didn't know exactly how. Now, unbeknownst to me at that time, my Granny was creating an aesthetic object for us to consume. The taste of those tea cakes I can remember to this very day. But in no way am I able to repeat or replicate those tea cakes in their exact form, their exact texture, and their exact taste. Now, my Granny being an artist in creating those tea cakes means that she expressed herself through those tea cakes. My inability to replicate that means that that was a unique form of expression. Now, does that mean that no one else ever in the history of mankind can replicate those tea cakes? Of course it doesn't. What it means is that it's such a unique creation. It's an expression. She took the attributes of flour, sugar, water, and whatever else, and she organized them in such a way as to arrive at those tea cakes. And those tea cakes will never, ever be replicated in the same way ever. Now, when we think in terms of listening to music, we can also think in terms of listening to music as my experience with eating those tea cakes. We make conscious decisions as to what we're going to listen to in music. And we make unconscious decisions as to what we're going to listen to in music. This is this distinction I want to clarify as being an active listener versus a passive listener. A passive listener is engaged with what he or she is listening to, but they're not intricately engaged. They're only passively engaged. They hear the sounds. They may even hear the lyrics, which are often the most recognizable component of music, but there's no insightful, intuitive delving into how these things are working together to express this message. Now, listening is the only mode of experiencing music. I'll say that again. Listening is the only mode of experiencing music. We cannot experience music unless we listen. But you say, balderdash, certainly we can. Well, let's think about it. Now, I have a musical score in front of me here. I am reading the score. And in essence, I am listening. Now, there's no sound going on, but there are symbols, and there is a lexicon of symbols that I can interpret, and my mind interprets those symbols as sound. So technically, yes, I do hear the music in my mind. Composers do that. Composers will hear ideas long before they put pen to those ideas, and much longer before anyone actually performs those ideas. Listening is the only mode of experiencing music. As a performer, you say, well, performers play instruments, but it's impossible to play an instrument without listening. And many times they pre-listen. They hear it before it happens. This is what we call the impact of expression, because expression is an intuitive and purposeful act where you take the material and you express what you hope or you believe the composer desired to be the message. You say listening is not involved when I put my earphones in and my earbuds. I've just got it there to occupy time and help me study better. Well, you're still listening. Now, you may be doing a very poor job of active listening, but you are listening. So music as an aesthetic art form is only discernible through the process of listening. And here we want to emphasize not just listening, but critically listening. How does the composer create music? Since the composer is organizing sound, they generally always have a purpose in mind when they're organizing this sound. Just as my granny had a purpose when she was organizing those ingredients for those tea cakes, composers will have a purpose when they organize sound. They organize the attributes of music, the pitch, the melodies, the rhythm, the timbre, the texture, all of those things. And they will do it in such a way as to achieve the desired message that they want to communicate to the listener. On that hand, let's talk about musical style or genre. Because genre or musical style arises only when a composer or a group of composers or a group of performers, when they focus on a common set of attributes and they manipulate them in a similar fashion. And so each time I hear them perform, manipulating those attributes, that is pitch, melody, rhythm, harmony, in such a way, it's similar. It could be totally different compositions or music, but the manipulation and the selection of attributes is the same. This is what we refer to as musical style or musical genre. And consequently, we'll often categorize music according to its style. It's jazz, it's bebop jazz, it's cool jazz, it's classical, it's romantic music, it's new wave, it's hip hop, on and on and on and on. These are genre or styles. And more often than not, those styles always share a focus on the same attributes and manipulate those attributes in similar ways or fashions. Now, someone could take hip hop, and this has been done, as you know. They could take hip hop, select some different attributes to manipulate, and manipulate them in totally different ways. Is this not how we distinguish between various genres of hip hop? After all, there is no one hip hop. There are various styles: East Coast, West Coast, new wave, cool. All of these things are only distinguishable because of the attributes that are focused on to manipulate and the ways in which those attributes are manipulated. Now, there are different types of listeners, and here's the key to our current discussion on how do you listen to music. As I said, my students of the past have often found this dialogue and this discussion to be very helpful, because what it actually does is that it legitimizes their listening experiences. You have to remember, when we listen to music, we make conscious and unconscious choices. We choose what we're going to listen to, we choose what we're going to focus on, and we, to a certain extent, choose how long we're going to focus on those things. In doing those things, we can often impact what the results of our listening experiences are. For example, the first type of listener is what I refer to as the pedantic listener. Now, pedantic listening is characterized by a very narrow, ostentatious concern for the technicalities and formal rules of music. A pedantic listener would certainly focus on the melody and the harmony, but they would focus it on it from what I refer to as a theoretical perspective. How does the composer do this? What elements is the composer using? What chordal structures? What sequences of chords? These are all pedantic issues and certainly amenable to discussion at the professional level. But the average human being who has not even been educated as to what the attributes of music are may never get to the level of being a pedantic listener. Pedantic listeners are advanced listeners, and they do it for the satisfaction of the critical analysis of the music. On the other hand, the illusory listener. The illusory listener will base their listening experience on something that's may or may not be true or real. And so we say their reaction to their listening experience is often an illusion. For example, passive listeners are illusory listeners. They're engaged with the aesthetic object, that is the music, the sound, the organized sound, but they never delve deep enough into the sound to perceive its true aesthetic attributes. They only listen in a superficial way. Now, even more critical here is that they will often leave that listening experience with a value. Illusory listeners form values just as pedantic listeners do. But those values are not informed on very much that's actually present in the music itself. Doesn't mean that it's not informed by some things present in the music itself, but it's not a comprehensive style of listening. The illusory listener will often make statements such as, I like this song, or I like that music. And as you know, I'll ask why, and they will say, because it's got a beat, it's got a feel, it's got a rhythm, it makes me move. These are not in any way negative or bad statements, but they're illusory because one must remember that the composer has purposefully organized sound in an effort to express an idea. And the illusory listener will never perceive or conceive that idea. And so the illusory listener robs him or herself of the value associated with the composer's efforts. We'll have more to say about that later when we discuss whether or not there's good music or bad music. But for now, we've got two types of listeners, the pedantic, and that's your typical music professor who has nothing to do but analyze scores and listen to music and decide whether or not Bach was using a tetrachord here, etc. And you have your illusory listener on the other end who is so not consumed with focusing on the musical attributes, but yet still forming some value judgments and even having an aesthetic experience, but not a very good one. Finally, we have the affective listener. Now for me, this is where we always begin with teaching listening skills. I desire for the students that I work with to become affective listeners. Now, as you know, affect with an A refers to moods, feelings, attitudes, emotions. So the affective listener will always relate what they hear in the music to a mood, to a feeling, to an attitude, to a value. They use their imagination, but here's what's key. They don't use their imagination in isolation of what the composer organized. They perceive all of the attributes of the composer's efforts, the style and the genre. They perceive the rhythm, the melody, the pitches, the timbre, the texture. And in perceiving all of those things, they perceive the message intended by the composer. Now, it's not always the same message because music doesn't communicate a unified one-time message to everyone. What's critical here is that they perceive something and they react with an emotion, that they react with a mood, they react with a feeling. And they often describe these things in terms of adjectives: happy, sad, melancholy, angry, confusing. Or they describe it in terms of an event that it reminds them of: a pleasant event, a non-pleasant event, my mother, or whatever. What's key here, and why we focused on developing effective listening skills, is because we can always tie our value decisions on that music back to the music itself. So, in an effective listening experience, a listener would say, the melody sounds happy. And obviously the next question is going to be, what in the melody sounds happy? How does the composer achieve the affect of happiness by organizing that melody? And you can do this. If you think in terms of our exercise on Ring Around the Rosie, a composer, depending upon what their focus is, can communicate various affects or emotions or feelings or imaginative states, depending upon how they manipulate the attributes. In one case, we could manipulate it in such a way that most people will say, oh, that song sounds happy. Ring Around the Rosie, it's very happy. A different composer can take that same melody and treat it in such a way by manipulating texture, form, timbre, harmony, melody, manipulating it in such a way that it doesn't sound happy, but it may sound passive or angry. Still, another composer can take that same melody and manipulate those attributes in such a way as to attain from you an effective response of confusion or scariness. Now, this is not to say that the composer's intent should always be perceived by the listener. I would never say that. What I would say is that whatever decision and response one has in effective listening, they have to defend that response with something that's in the music that causes that effective state. So if we say that something sounds angry, tell me about the musical attributes, the way they are combined and manipulated that achieves that anger. If we say that it sounds happy, we have to do likewise. Of essence here is that there will always be a response, an effective response, an emotional response, and we'll be better informed to discuss and defend the why it sounds happy and why it sounds sad and why it sounds angry. Because we can certainly manipulate attributes and devices in such a way as to achieve those emotional responses. So what we're actually responding to when we listen to music is the manipulation of attributes. Therefore, it's really necessary to have a very firm understanding of what those attributes are. Now, another thing is, how do we describe our responses when we listen to music? As I've said, you've got the three types of listeners, and we're only going to focus on the effective listener. So most of our descriptions will be describing our experiences in terms of feelings and emotions. And the most appropriate means of describing it will be the use of adjectives or metaphors. Now, to say that music is happy does not really mean that it is happy. It means that the way the composer combined the things, the attributes, makes you feel happy. And that's an excellent response. But then you have to tell why and what the composer did with those attributes in order to make it sound happy. Because certainly, happy is an emotion. And many times, different things make different people happy. What's happy to you may not be happy to me. The beauty of effective listening is that there is no right or wrong response, as long as there is an effective response. And the real beauty is that that effective response has to be defended and explained in terms of the musical attributes. So here, we're challenged to not only have an effective response to what we hear, but to be able to critically articulate why that effective response occurred. Now, often I hear the term, and I'm sure you've heard it too, music is the greatest mode of communication. Music communicates. Music is communicating to me. It communicated this to me. Well, music does not communicate. Think, for example, what is the process of communicating? Communicating involves the formation and transmittal of a proposition. Now, certainly I am communicating now, and I'm communicating verbally through language. I'm offering propositions, or what I refer to as statements. Now, a proposition is no more than a statement, and it's presented for consideration. If I say, the dog is brown, ran down the street, the car hit him, I'm informing you that a brown dog ran down the street and was hit by a car. Now, if you English, you have no problems with accepting that proposition. Now, you have very little evidence that it's true or false, but certainly I am communicating my message to you. If I say, Peter has $10 in his pocket, I hope he will give me 5 of those dollars. Again, we don't know that Peter has $10. We know my desire is to get 5 of those dollars if it is true. So my proposition I can accept or I can invalidate it. Does Peter have $5? We all speak English, and so you're listening to this conversation, and I am communicating not only to Peter, please give me $5, but I'm communicating to you also because you can interpret the words without even thinking about them. So language in itself is a mode of communicating because it is indelibly tied to propositions, statements which are clear, which are communicatable, which are discernible, that we are comprehensible. Remember those terms? Yes. In other words, you can understand what it is that I'm saying if you speak English. Now, if you speak no English, it would be difficult for you to comprehend. Does that mean that I am not communicating to you? Well, that's open to argument because it's my effort to communicate that's most valuable here. You may not receive the message. And so I would have to argue that communication broke down. On the other hand, music is not a series of propositions. This is critical to us. Whereas language is literal and verbal to the extent that we can agree on what a cup is, and we can agree what soda is. And so therefore, if I say I am drinking a cup of soda, I have communicated clearly because we agree on the propositions. In music, it's not that simple because we don't agree on what is soft or what is loud or what is medium loud or what is happy or what is sad. Music is not literal to the extent that it does not literally tell you the intent of the composer. You have to listen and interpret for yourselves. Whereas verbal language is literal to the extent that if you speak the language, it's clear that the line of communication should be open. With music, there is no language of music. They are attributes, and those attributes are combined in such a way as to express ideas. But my expression of that idea has to be discernible, perceived by you. Now, does that make my music good or bad? Well, it depends. So for the sake of our listening experiences, we'll always focus on whether or not there is an effective response, an effective value associated with the music. And we'll tie that response and value back into the attributes, how they were manipulated, and we'll talk about those things. The composer did this, or the performer did this. And here's how he used the melody, and here's how he used harmony, and here's how he used rhythm. And as a result of that, it communicated to me, an effect of happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, or whatever. The critical component here is that we're responding to the attributes or the aesthetic attributes in the music itself. So the issue of music communicating is highly problematic. And henceforth, we won't refer to music as being a communicative mode. It's an expressive mode. And my expression may differ from your expression and may communicate a totally different message than you would have communicated. But it is this individual level of expression that is the beautiful component of music being an aesthetic art. That brings us to how we assign value to music. Now, we assign value to music often in terms of its ability to elicit that emotional response. But you'll say, well, I didn't feel anything. Well, psychologists will tell you it's impossible not to feel anything. You will always feel something. The mere fact that you acknowledge that you felt nothing is feeling something. It's a vacuous experience, but it can be easily filled by focusing or refocusing on what it is that you listen to, considering what were the devices that the composer or the performer used to express these ideas. Now, will those ideas, as you perceive them, be the same ideas that the composer intended? It will often be different, but that makes it all the more fun, as my grandmother would say. We can respond to music independent of directly perceiving what the composer actually intended for us to perceive, because the composer's intent is his expressive objective. Now, and here's where we come to the issue of what is good music and what is not good music. I would submit to you that good music is music that has the ability to clearly establish those affective states amongst many people, as opposed to a narrow component of people. So does it have to be the same affective state? Of course not. Does it have to be an affective state? Yes. So good music will cross the boundaries of time, genre, style, instrumentation. Good music will exist on its own because of its ability to elicit affective and emotional responses from the listener, and recognizing that those responses may greatly differ amongst listeners and audiences. The key is that there is a response, and music's ability to elicit that response classifies it as being good or not good. Hence, we'll never have to get into the discussion of whether or not some music is better than other, because it will be evident from our responses to that music. So at this point, let's briefly summarize. Sound. We're surrounded by sound, and music is a special case of sound in which the composer organizes that sound to attain or achieve a desired effect or response from the listener. Music is an aesthetic art form because the attributes have to be focused on when we're listening to music. And the only way to experience music is through listening. There are different types of listeners. The pedantic will often focus only on the technical aspects of it, independent of the affective aspects, or sometimes even independent of the truly aesthetic aspects. The illusory listener will make some progress towards establishing a value judgment, but will not delve deep enough into the object, the music, the aesthetic object itself, to discern how the composer or what exactly the composer is doing that leads to his or her value judgment. So often the value judgments are superficial and simply tap the surface of the listening experience. And finally, the affective listener, which for us is the best kind. because it makes listening to music amenable to everyone. There's no formal training necessary. There's no knowledge of pedagogy or how to teach music, or there's no knowledge of how to read music. It's simply listening and responding. And our responses will always be affective responses. That is emotion, attitude, feelings that we interpret from our experience with how the composer manipulated the attributes. Music doesn't truly communicate because music is not a propositional language as verbal English, Spanish, Italian are propositional languages. For that matter, music is not even a language. It is an expressive aesthetic art form where a composer or performer expressively creates something to achieve a desired effect. Now, that desired effect may not always be perceivable by everyone. So we say that good music is simply music that attains an effective response from many, many, many people. And it doesn't have to be the same effective response. But we can always tie those effective responses back into the attributes of the music and how the composer manipulated those attributes. You'll have a lot of fun listening to music, hopefully, as a result of this discussion that we've had. The key here is to think in terms of listening as an active listener versus a passive listener, to listen critically versus listening detached, and to understand that your listening experiences will always be valuable to you. What is necessary is that you are able to defend those values by answering the question, why?